Well, welcome to the third day of the panel. We've got some amazing folks to talk with y'all today. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by letting them talk a bit about their work and introduce themselves. I guess I should also say I'm Caroline Lindquist. I am currently a graduate student at UC Berkeley, pursuing my master's in landscape architecture. And we'll go ahead and start with Adriana. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and how you're working with the next generation and ensuring that kids have access to nature and also that they're able to have connections regardless of socioeconomic, racial, or geographic considerations?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, am I muted? Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my name's Adriana. I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming to you guys from Woodland, California. I'm in the Sacramento metropolitan area. I am currently a recreation coordinator with the City of Woodland Parks and Rec Department, specifically with youth and teen services. So I get to do all of the programming, particularly in after school and summer camps. That's my two big focuses for all of our youth and teens in our city. A lot of what I've done previous to this has been in and around education with our school district and after school programs, that kind of thing. So I've worked with kids for many, many years now. We have a lot of really awesome programs with what I do. One of my favorite things that I have yet to be a part of because I just stepped into my role this year is an outdoor adventure program in our department that we take a group of 30 to 40 students to Yosemite every year for a 5-day trip. And what's great about most of our programs is we have great funding through our city. We're funded by a lot of different tax measures. So a lot of our programs are subsidized and very affordable. And on top of that, we have scholarships. So regardless of socioeconomics, background, or any barriers like that, parents can apply for scholarships to cut costs literally in half for any of our programs. And just as an example, like our summer camp that's 10 weeks long is approximately $400, which for California is very affordable. And our scholarships cut that rate in half. So just great accessibility. We're super local. All of our programs run out of our local parks. We have 26 parks in our town, and our town is really small. So most of our stuff is walkable to most of our participants. A lot of it, if it's not walkable, it's accessible by our city buses, which are free to all youth under 18. So it's really nice. I'd say we're pretty accessible. We also have our great community center that we run out of that is not open right now because of COVID, unfortunately, but in normal situations, it would be with an open gym and things like that. But that's a little bit about my work and what I do and how we're accessible to all of our kiddos.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Zuza, can you go ahead and jump in and talk a little bit about your organization? You're muted right now.
My name is Zuza Bulay. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Promotores Verdes and the Education Director and Deputy Director for Americas for Conservation and the Arts. The Promotores Verdes program started out originally as a youth programming that is called United Cultures for Arts and Conservation. And that was envisioned by about 20 different stakeholders in Colorado and nationally that try to envision the most diverse youth education program to actually create a pipeline for the natural conservation careers. And out of that program, then we realized, especially working with diverse communities and diverse population, that that we needed to address all the education and everything to the families, because families are really the key support network for most of the youth that we wanted to work with. And by leaving the family aside, we're actually doing more of a disservice. You will pretend like you sprinkle some fairy dust, but it really doesn't grab any hold or grows roots, because that network of community and support is missing. So connecting kids to nature is really important to actually advance and grow their social emotional intelligence, and also promotes physical and intellectual development for all children, because it allows them to discover and explore their own surroundings. And then using or sharing the same materials actually with the families has the effect that families become just much more cohesive and really excited about continuing to work and participate in all events and programming. All of our programming is for free, and we engage families in different sort of stair steps. We come to, usually we enrich and embellish community events, or also enrich the programming of educational partners that want to become more diverse. So we start out in local neighborhoods, in local neighborhood parks, sometimes even just green lots nearby or a greenway. And then as the programming is going on throughout the year, we then also venture out at least once a month into regional parks, and then also national sites that give this awe effect for families. Our programming includes camping. It includes working with schools directly to do bioblitzes, not only engaging the school students, but actually also including parents, because our Promotores Verdes are all parents that have children of different ages. And when they work with our community, they always come with their children. That's part of the agreement for all of our community partners, that they understand that Promotores will show up as a family. I think what makes our programming unique is the connection, but not only connecting families to nature, but also connecting them to the health benefits of nature, learning about how nature and free time in nature actually benefits your own health, then really motivates families to continue participating in events. And we connect the health nature connection then with conservation action. That means we collect native seeds, maybe tree plantings, trash cleanups, and so on. And engaging families in those activities actually allows for placemaking to happen. And many of the families we work with are immigrants and refugees that don't really have a place to call their own. And that makes a big difference to then understand that whatever we're doing is actually a continuum of the people that have lived in these spaces and safeguarded them for us to enjoy, and that we are continuing to do so. And we're very lucky in Colorado because there's a lot of public land out there, and it belongs to everyone. That then creates an agency that transfers and is integrated into everybody's personal lives.
Great. Thank you so much, Susa. We'll come back to you, but I want to make sure that we get everyone a good intro here. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to Janie. So if you can tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and also how it connects children to the mental health benefits of nature and ensures equitable access. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Janie Rasmussen, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm the senior campaign representative for the Outdoors Alliance for Kids, or OAK, in youth out of Sierra Club. And I live in Washington, D.C., which is the occupied land of the Nacotchtank or Anacostans. So the Outdoors Alliance for Kids, or OAK, is a national strategic partnership of over 100 organizations and businesses working to connect children, youth, and families to the outdoors. We've been in operation since 2010, so this year is our 10th anniversary, and we had all sorts of celebrations planned, and then 2020 turned out the way that it did. So we didn't get to celebrate pretty much at all. And in fact, we've really just been focusing on increasing our equity principles and committing to racial equity and justice. So, we didn't get to celebrate, but it is good that we were able to take that time to focus on those efforts. But since 2010, OAK has been advocating for policies, funding, and programming at the federal, state, and local levels to make sure that there's equitable and readily available opportunities for children, youth, and families to connect with the outdoors and the physical and mental health benefits that they provide. Families really do, I think, have the leading role in connecting kids to the outdoors, because there's so many opportunities as a family, and it's the ideal environment for children to connect with nature and do so as a family. But OAK does fight to reduce barriers, whether they be geographical, social, racial, financial, or all of the above, to access and to develop equitable opportunities, skills, and encouragement, so that all kids, regardless of their background, can connect with the great outdoors and benefit from the mental and physical health benefits. Some of our flagship achievements have been expanding First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative to Let's Move Outside. We did that back in 2010, and championing the Every Kid in a Park program, which is now called Every Kid Outdoors, successfully advocating for the boring stuff, the appropriations every year, but it's so incredibly important to advocate for that funding year in and year out, because it could so easily go away. And so we're always advocating in the appropriations process and beyond for strong and consistent youth outdoor access funding. And we've been successful in contributing and advocating for historical policy wins. Some of those have happened just in the past 2 years, including the Great American Outdoors Act, passed earlier this summer, and the John Dingell Public Lands Act of 2019, through which we passed the Every Kid Outdoors Act of 2019. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we have a lot going on with all of our programs, including the Every Kid Outdoors program. If you're not familiar with Every Kid Outdoors, it's the PASS program that allows fourth graders and their families free access to national parks and public lands and waters for a full year for them and their families. And so, in addition to promoting that program and championing it and passing and working to save it from elimination from administrations that were threatening to get rid of it, we passed the Every Kid Outdoors Act to at least authorize it for 7 years. We're working to remove that sunset provision and also create some really solid funding opportunities that connect the Every Kid Outdoors program to the larger picture of youth outdoor access and beyond, especially related to the COVID crisis. So again, I'll have plenty more opportunities throughout this panel and our breakout groups to brag about OAK. I've only been part of OAK for about 1.5 years now. OAK's been doing this incredible work for 10 years, but thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to engage in this panel.
Great, thank you so much, Janie. And I'm looking forward to digging into some other questions for letting you have an opportunity to talk about that more. But we'll go ahead and pop over to Tim. So Tim, if you could talk a little bit about your work with Biophilic cities and ensuring access to nature for kids and connecting them to the mental health benefits, that would be great.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. So my name is Tim Beatty. I wear several hats connected to nature. One is as a faculty member here in the Urban and Environmental Planning Department at the University of Virginia, where I have taught for about 30 years and teach a lot of things that have to do with designing nature into place, into cities, and actually teach a large cities and nature class every spring. But mainly want to tell you about biophilic cities, as Caroline says. This refers to both a vision really of cities and future urbanism, but it's also a network and a network of cities, but also organizations and people. So we started this in around 2013. We have 24 cities. Actually, just this past week, Toronto is now an official partner city in our network. We're excited about that. So it's growing. But just to say a little bit about the vision, because it's really important. It's a really vision-driven kind of network of cities. So biophilic cities, biophilic using the word biophilic, referring to biophilia, the idea that we are hardwired really to need that and want that connection with the natural world, that we're happier, healthier, able to lead meaningful lives when we have nature all around us. And so we believe that a biophilic city is a deeply natureful city. It's a place where we have nature all around us. Nature is not just something that we get once or twice on a holiday. It has to be all around us. We have to have it daily, hourly, really. And so it becomes a challenge for us to see how we can design and plan cities that are deeply natureful. Every city in our network is pursuing this agenda in different ways, but increasingly they are really pushing the idea, pushing the envelope, if you will, and this idea of an immersive nature city. So a city that's not just a place where you have some nature or some parks that you have to find and visit, but rather living in the park, living in the forest, living in an ecosystem. We do. But it's really a different way of thinking about cities. So let's see, just address the second part. What are our cities doing, and how do we work to ensure that every child has connection to nature? And we're not an organization that focuses just on children or just on kids. We like to say this is the vision of biophilic cities is a whole of city vision, in the sense that it is a rooftop or a room, it's building, and all the way out to region or bioregion and all the scales in between, a whole of city approach. So it's biophilic design of buildings, but it's also protection and restoration of the regional ecosystem. Well, whole of life is another way that we talk about it. So it's every age and every phase of life in a biophilic city is one where you have deep connections to the natural world. And the equity part of it is one that's increasingly a focus of our cities. And I'll stop, but I want to make sure that I don't forget to say, go visit our website, biophilic-cities.org. And one of the portions of that webpage is a list of films. So we're often telling stories about the wonderful things that our cities are doing through short documentary films. We find that's very effective. And there are a few that several that relate especially to equity and this idea of just biophilia, that biophilia and connections to nature are a birthright. And so we need every city, every resident in every city needs that connection and deserves that connection. So Colley Park, for example, a neighborhood of color in Portland, wonderful story of engaging that neighborhood, really designing and owning that wonderful new park there. The 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, the homegrown program in Milwaukee that takes vacant lots and designs them, puts them together to create wonderful pocket parks in underserved neighborhoods in that city. So there are wonderful stories and great things that our cities are doing. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. And I'll let you talk more about this in a minute, but I also wanted to say, I don't know if you got to the scale of the Biophilic Cities Network. I dropped the website for it in the chat, but it's not just the national scale, it's international cities.
Yes, that's right.
Amazing.
So yeah, I mean, we have Wellington, New Zealand, Singapore, Victoria just as the capital of the Basque Country. We have a lot of our member cities around the world.
Yeah, so check it out. You're welcome. You're welcome. So I'm going to go ahead and circle back to Adriana, and then I also am seeing some questions in the chat, so we'll get to those as well. But if you could talk a little bit about how you all have shifted your programming a little bit in the midst of COVID. I know you mentioned that the gyms are closed, but how are you still reaching these communities, especially those that are more in need and have less access?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, a big part of what we do typically is after school programs and summer camps. And currently school is still virtual in California. And our summer camps on a normal summer would serve anywhere from 150 to 200 families. And not only is that a safe space for kids to get out and play and be outdoors, but it's childcare for a lot of families. So when COVID hit, we knew that we had to still offer something. Like, we had to modify whatever we could and still make programs happen, because people are still working. There's essential workers. There's people that have been working since the beginning of the pandemic and they still need childcare. So we managed to make our programs, we spread our programs out. We went to more parks than we normally would. We had more sites. We had significantly smaller groupings. So instead of having a group of 50 kids at a park, we went down to small groups of 10. And that's the way we had to do it. And we had to implement all of our social distancing guidelines. But the fact that we were outside all day was hugely beneficial and worked in our favor for a lot of what our county guidelines required of us. And then moving into the fall, when we would typically shift to after school spaces and having those safe spaces for these kids to get out and play still in the outdoor spaces, we had to still provide something because school is virtual. So what we did is similar to what Melanie was talking about in yesterday's panel, is we've shifted into being this distance learning hub, where our community center that is still closed to the public has these small groups of students that come to us for distance learning. And we fill their class breaks, their recess time, their after school time with all of this recreation, all of this outdoor time as much as we can, so that they're still getting the socializing with their peers. They're still getting outdoor time. They're still getting all of these other things that they would normally get in our spaces as much as they can during COVID. So that's one of the huge shifts that we've had to meet in our community, is this need for childcare. That's still been a huge need. And without school, it's an even bigger need. So we've tried to meet as much of that as we can while still getting our kids into our parks, into play spaces, and just having that free time.
Yeah, chiming in here from the Promotores Verdes program, we had to adjust quite a bit as well, in particular because we're working with very vulnerable communities. We're working with Native American families and Latino and immigrant and refugee families who have been really at the front lines in not only job-wise, but also with being affected disproportionately with having COVID or being exposed to it. So there's a lot of fear, and the fear of being out in the wild in places that you are not familiar with is real. Just like Aliyah was talking about earlier. And so we continued with programming with small in-person events that don't have more than 12 people at a time for most part, also with social distancing and masks. And we have been weaving in forest and nature therapy in particular, because to relieve stress and also to offer tools to the families and children to actually learn of what to do with even a short time outdoors, to connect more deeply, not only with nature, but also with their own ancestral roots and their fears, and with each other, actually. So that has been very successful, to the point that I get daily requests, because I offer these forest therapy walks at request for free. And I get daily requests from different organizations and from different pods from schools. And it has been very, very fun, because it is for myself also a form of self-care. yeah, that is mainly of how we adjusted. We hear a lot of anecdotal references to being zoomed out. And but with forest and nature therapy and free time outdoors, the zooming in and zooming out is one of the techniques that really helps you to sometimes detach from your own personal stressors and unclutter your mind a little bit. So yeah, that's our part here of what I can comment about the responses to COVID.
Great, thank you so much, Zuza. And Janie, I know you and I have talked a little bit offline about the ways that y'all have been trying to adjust in the midst of COVID, specifically with the pass for kids to get to national parks and extending that to state parks. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great. Oh, yep. Also, sorry, one thing before you jump in, I saw that Dana threw a little heart in when she heard something that Zuza said that really resonated with her using the reactions button. So if you guys, if anything really stands out to you, feel free to throw a reaction in and just kind of keep a little engagement going between the panel. Yeah, I see the clapping. Thanks, Dana. Go ahead, Jenny.
Such an underused Zoom feature. So thanks for calling on it. Makes it a little bit more dynamic for the panelists who are speaking at a bunch of little squares. So yeah, thanks so much, Carol. And that's really a good point for how we're adapting to COVID. And so, you know, I'll talk a little bit more about the funding in a second, but yeah, the Every Kid Outdoors program, unfortunately, you know, this is a flagship program for us. It's something that we advocate for very strongly and have protected throughout the years and worked on funding for. But, you know, one of the unfortunate things is that, you know, we just kept hearing from families this past year that they weren't able to use their pass for the most crucial months that they were hoping to use it, which is the summer months and the spring months after school has been let out, because they were adhering to state or local government mandates, or they were following CDC guidelines. I myself actually had to go to a few parks when I was traveling across the country because I was moving back and forth between Idaho, and witnessed myself, I couldn't actually stick around in a lot of national park sites because they were so crowded. It was impossible to maintain social distancing. And so families that were trying to keep themselves and others safe were not able to use their pass the way that they would have. So we've called on Secretary Bernhardt, the Secretary of the Interior, to extend the Every Kid Outdoors pass from the 2019-2020 pass into 2020-2021. And so Oak has had a sign-on letter that in support of that ask, and then also has had over, I think it's 7,500 emails from supporters directly to Secretary Bernhardt's desk, making that request, and also have now a bunch of requests directly from our youth advocates. So we're making that strong call. We expect to have a win on this, especially since we got some decent coverage from some news outlets, admittedly very Beltway specific news outlets, but those are the ones that, you know, the Secretary of the Interior pays attention to. So that's a good thing. Just, you may not have heard us. You may not have seen us in the headlines, I guess, this month, but we are in the news, making that request. So we hope to be successful with that. And in general, we're making consistent, just to expand beyond the Every Kid Outdoors program, we're doing quite a bit to leverage this unprecedented public understanding of the critical importance of public outdoor access. I'm going to have to pop in the chat the specific researcher who theorized this, but basically, you know, it's very difficult to make change happen when equity is at play until it affects the majority, until it affects white people. And so the fact that even white people are being affected by limited outdoor access means that we have an opportunity to leverage that and get support for outdoor access. And that includes funding. And so we're constantly advocating for funding, but especially this year, we've been requesting stimulus funding, and we're making a huge push to have decision makers support park agency funding and also to support park adjacent nonprofits, because research does show that anytime there's a national economic downturn, park agencies are the first to be cut. even though local decision makers will always say that parks are a priority and they support them and the public supports them and they'll tout it at on every platform and in every debate, but when it comes down to it and they're making the budgets, they cut Parks and Rec when it comes to economic downturns. And so we need to leverage this public support to make sure that we know that access to nature is an absolute necessity. It's not just a nice to have, and this COVID crisis completely demonstrates that. And so we're working to do that. And it's also, just to tie Every Kid Outdoors back into it, we're working to extend the Every Kid Outdoors pass to state park systems through our Every Kid Outdoors and State Parks initiative, so that you have these extra levels of outdoor access and reducing barriers to those different levels of a park access. And so, yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that later too, but also want to give Tim a chance to address this question as well.
Great, thanks so much. And Tim, if you want to pick up where you were talking about equity, and also maybe talk a little bit about some of y'all's work with Chattahoochee Hills Charter School to talk about the design planning process.
Okay, well, I wasn't necessarily planning to talk about the pandemic, but I think it's a really interesting set of things that we're kind of learning about how our cities are responding. And our work with the network is largely virtual already. As you noted, it's an international network, and we're in lots of different time zones, and we're doing a lot of things online to begin with. But each of our cities has some really interesting stories about how they're adapting in real time, and some of their initiatives are really quite innovative. We know, as Janie said, if there's a silver lining from the pandemic, it's this appreciation for nature, this recognition or reconnection, if you will, to. We're hearing birds, and I get a lot of people asking me about, are there more birds, and are they louder than they used to be? Well, no, they're stressed and fewer birds in many places. But what's going on is people are paying attention, maybe in a way they didn't before, and they have time. And they're looking, and there's a solace and a therapeutic value that's really essential in the pandemic. And all of our cities are working hard to make that connection to nature still work in this context. So the city of Portland, one of the biggest parks, Forest Park, a 5,000 acre park, well, they've figured out how to make all the trails one way, and they can sort of maximize the number of people who can enjoy that park. One of the really interesting questions for us, a research question that I'll throw out, is just trying to understand the extent to which investment in nature in our cities in some ways are predictive of the COVID response and the effectiveness of responses in cities. And so mentioned Singapore, really interesting case study. There's a city that's really committed to nature and expanding the green elements of that city. It's a very dense, compact city, but it's also incredibly natureful. And it's a city of 5.7 million population, but they have experienced only 28 deaths from COVID. To what extent does that nature make a population more resilient, in a healthier population that's better able to fight that virus? Obviously, Singapore does a lot of things really well, investing in healthcare and contact tracing and all the things that every city and country needs to be doing. But we're going to try to answer some of those questions. We have a research project right now where we're starting to focus in on our partner cities and collect as much data and information, anecdotal stories too, about the role of nature in responding to COVID. I didn't answer the second part of your question about the equity and we have some wonderful stories about what cities are doing to connect kids to nature. And I was just going to quickly mention three, and you're going to feel free to cut me off if I'm going too long, Caroline. One is this school example, Chattahoochee Hills Charter School, just outside Atlanta. And that's a school, we've made a little 5 or 6 minute film about it that's on biophiliccities.org if you'd like to look. But it's a school that's designed from the beginning, not as a single building, but as a series of buildings. And the kids expect every day that they're going to be moving around outside. So they come with boots and jackets, and they take their lessons, science and math and English, into the forest. And it's a wonderful story of a school. That's a really quick description of this as a deeper story to tell. A second example from Portland, Oregon, another partner city, where during the month of September, these Voxus swifts, these are migratory swifts, come through the city, and they roost in very dramatic fashion in a chimney in an elementary school. And it's a wonderful story of how the kids and the school actually raised money to buy another heating system so they could leave the chimney open for the birds. And 5, 6, 7,000 birds at one time roost in this chimney. And we have again another 6 or 7 minute film about it. And hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people, it seems, kids and families, descend on the school every night in September as the sun goes down to watch this incredible, wondrous spectacle of these birds as they roost in this chimney. And maybe I'll stop. I won't tell you what the third one is because I know I'm taking too much time.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Tim. And I'm glad you got to the Singapore parts, because I was going to say, if you all have more questions about that, Tim did a great international conference in Singapore within the past 2 years, year and a half.
Yeah.
Remember?
When was it? A year ago.
April, a year ago?
Time is sort of,
yeah, time is all a mess right now.
Yeah.
But if you're in his breakout room, there's some really interesting information.
We could talk more about Singapore.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to a few questions from the chat that we've been getting. Thank you. We've got some good ones from Dana in here, and I'll start out with this one. Dana asked, this is for both Zuza and Janie, are state parks currently included in the pass, or is that being proposed? I guess that one's more towards Janie, and then I'll follow up with another one she has. So.
Sure. Yeah, I just will go ahead and sorry, I put this in the chat, but just to elaborate on it, as part of the promotion for the Every Kid Outdoors Pass originally back in 2015, when the pass was first created, the Obama administration encouraged state park systems to accept the pass. And so currently the states that continue to do that, even through past the centennial celebration through which EKO was established, Maryland, New York, Wyoming, and Idaho. And then New Mexico and Nevada have created their own pass for 5th graders. And then Texas just passed a law, which was actually written and which the idea of which was proposed by an actual 5th grader, Lily Kay in Texas. I'll pop in a little blog post about her story. And that established the EKO pass for 5th graders. But unfortunately, at the very last minute, some legislators in some closed door meetings stripped out the language to include families in that. So, it basically did nothing because it established it permanently in law, but it didn't allow families to be included, which was really the only thing that was being changed by this law, because kids her age are already allowed free admittance into Texas state parks. So we're working with the K family to change that in Texas in the coming months. So I'll pop that in the chat, the story about that. And then just to note, 38 state parks currently have entry fees into their state park systems and do not accept the EKO pass. There are other ways that they work to mitigate that, but it's pretty inconsistent and not widely available.
Yeah, thank you, Danny, for your update on this. In Colorado, the state park passes are accessible through libraries. You can, request them for a week at a time, and they have a limited number. Maybe each library brand has 1 or 2 of these passes that can be lent out to families. So it's very limited how families can receive free access to state parks. But I think I see a great potential, like Jani was talking about, of actually putting it at the legislative agenda, in particular because our governor just pronounced that it is really important to stress and highlight environmental education in Colorado due to the wildfires and effects on climate change. And part of his running platform and his first initiatives were early childhood education. So with that combination, I think there's a strong opportunity here, and I would love to work with Jani, with Oak, to actually move that forward and use the platform of Promotores Verdes and other groups to move towards this Bill of Rights for children in the outdoors.
Great, thank you so much. And I was asked to share a little bit about some of the community engagement work that I did with Dorothea Dix Park in the master planning of it. So I wanted to be sure everyone got their chance to speak, but I'll share a little bit about that right now and then leave some minutes at the very end. But over the past 4 years, I've been really fortunate to get to work on the Dorothea Dix Park project in the city of Raleigh. That is a project that's working on transforming a former mental health hospital into the central park for the city. And I had the great joy of getting to lead the youth engagement process for the master planning of the park, which was a great opportunity because we were really trying to create a park that's unlike any other park the city has seen, and wanted to kind of break down the typical associations with what a park really is. And who better to dream big for a master planning process than a child? So we worked with kids and asked them things like, how do you feel when you play? How do you want to feel when you play? What can you design to help you feel that way? So again, we were taking the emotional approach because we didn't want to just hear the idea of slides, swing set, etc. We wanted to kind of push that notion broader. And a really interesting thing that we found was when we asked how they feel when they play, we would start out getting these answers like amazing, fun, happy, excited. And then without fail, regardless of the age from 5 to 13, we'd start to get scared, anxious, depressed, lonely, even from the 5-year-olds. And so we were wondering what was really happening here. And we started to dig into it and ask the kids, and they would say things like, I'm lonely because no one wants to play with me, or I'm scared to make friends. And one of the ways this started to translate was, I know it really, I see you, Adriana, it really was a lot to talk through. And one of the little girls that we worked with, her design plan that she came up with for this was something she called the Lonely House. And she said, well, if I'm lonely and I go there and somebody else is lonely and they go there, then we're not lonely anymore. And that has stuck with me a lot. And I think that raw emotional honesty that we are getting from the kids is something that is sometimes missing from the public engagement with older, with adults. And it's something that's increasingly important, especially in these times when we're really separated because of COVID. So I can talk a little bit more about some of that work in my panel, but or in my breakout room, but wanted to be sure to share some of that. Tim, did you have
Caroline, you had you wrote a wonderful article about it for our Biophilic Cities journal. So we have an online journal that you can find on the Biophilic Cities page called "A Park with a City in It." That was your subtitle anyway. Yeah. Wonderful photographs too. So everybody should find that article.
Thanks. I can try to drop that in the chat. But yeah, thanks for, I wanted to just give a little bit to share because there are some amazing kids with incredible ideas. You know, we did get the range of, I want to design a high dive into a pool of pudding, which wasn't the most feasible, but it did give us an idea that these kids wanted a sense of adventure that they weren't getting from their parks. So there can always be information gleaned from that engagement. So we have 2 minutes left. If anyone has some final remarks that they wanted to throw in from the panel, feel free to jump in now. I don't know if anyone has any kind of itching things they want to say.
Janie, go ahead. I saw you raise your hand.
Oh, go ahead, because no, go ahead, Adriana. I feel like we haven't heard from you enough. We've heard plenty of things.
Well, I just want to say that, like, I feel like this is such an important time for there to be a shift, especially in the way our education system is structured. Like, something that's so near and dear to my heart is the way our schools are set up. And I've seen so many places and so many schools that are shifting towards outdoor classrooms, outdoor learning, and learning gardens. And how do we get kids back to school safely with so much isolation and so much higher rates of depression right now with COVID and the way we are all living in the world right now. And unfortunately, schools are not safe because we can't all go back at the same time. And I think that this is such an important shift and a pivoting moment that we should really take advantage of. I'm going to drop a link into the chat as well for Green Schoolyards America, because I think they're doing awesome stuff. They have a great framework set up for anybody who partners with their school district or anything like that, of just partnering with landscape architects, like people like Tim and Caroline, to help them get outdoor classrooms set up for their kiddos so that they can safely get back to school. But I'll get off my soapbox now because you guys all know how important education is. So, yeah.
And I just want to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, like, everybody just give Adriana some props, because it is not easy being in her position right now. And like she said, she's already facing budget cuts in her agency, and she is one of representative of people across this country that make outdoor access possible and are making programming that actually directly is affecting people. And I work at the high level and do policy, and that's a part of it, but you're doing the real work at the ground level with real kids who need it. And I just really thank you for that. So everybody look up Adriana and learn more about the work she does, because she's doing some really amazing stuff.
Thanks for saying that, Janie. I think one of my favorite things about the SHIFT conference and also the Emerging Leaders program that Adriana and I have been lucky to be a part of is the incredible encouragement that has happened. We leave the ELP meetings every week just like completely fired up to go do things. And that's continued throughout the SHIFT conference. So thank you to everyone for that. Okay, so we have about a 10-minute break. It's 9-minute now, and we'll reconvene at the top of the hour. So feel free to go get some coffee, take a little break, and then we will pop into breakout rooms. And just a reminder, turn off your audio and video, and then we will circle back. So thank you to everyone on the panel. This has been a great conversation. So what we're going to do is just kind of spend some time recapping on the conversations that we've had. So I think panelists have been taking notes about what they heard in their group, and we'll take a little time to report back. And since we have a small group, if you have a question, feel free to, I don't think this is going to mess up the system. If you guys want to turn your videos on, if you feel comfortable, because it's a pretty small group. Okay, Adriana's a Zoom expert. She feels good about that. So, maybe we can make it more of a conversation. Tim, I saw some rigorous note-taking in your group. Do you want to start out?
Yeah, well, I decided I was just going to scribble, as I often do in my legal pad and my shorthand that I can't read later, but oh well. Yeah, we had wonderful conversations, small group, I think 4 in one and 6 in the second, but everybody had great things to contribute and wonderful stories. Let's see, just kind of in a linear fashion, in our first group, we talked about just the need to kind of think maybe beyond schools, think about the city in its totality, all the opportunities to experience nature all around that city. One of our attendees made a reference and a positive comment about our nature pyramid, which is something we've worked on through the Biophilic Cities project. The idea that we need that nature at the base of the pyramid, kind of like the food pyramid, that our healthy food diet has to sort of happen by the things that are all around us where we live and work, the bird song we hear, the ants we might see on the pavement. So that was kind of a major theme, that we need to be designing and redesigning actually spaces around the city to foster nature and to foster connections to nature. One person mentioned the peregrine falcons in her city and the importance of things like pocket parks and let's see what else. Lots of wonderful examples of places like a community in South Carolina where the kids go around looking for these hidden iron mice where they can use a QR. We had a lot of discussion around using technology to foster kind of a sense of adventure and awe and wonder and about the nature around in cities. And that was really cool. And I love the idea of kind of making the discovery of nature around us in cities to kids especially, but also to adults, something that's fun and interesting and a really important educational function of what we do in cities. Mention of the importance of things like trails in cities. And we talked about the example of the Beltline in Atlanta or the walking trails in Boston that combine nature and history. But we also need to have safe routes for kids to get around in the city. But that was a really good point. In several both discussions, we talked about bicycles, and bicycling came up as a really important way to to do multiple things: get exercise, be outside, slow down, maybe appreciate the nature around us. In the second session we started, I see Louise's face. Reminds you really brought this up, that we hadn't really talked yet on the panel about animals. And the importance of that nature connection, especially in cities. And I did mention the peregrine falcon example came up. So we spent a bit of time talking about animals. And actually, Louise told this wonderful story about a planning process that involved a lot of kids and getting their input. And they happened to be the only ones that brought up the importance of things like butterflies and ants and squirrels and birds. It wasn't the adults. So really important in our planning for cities to capture all the voices, but especially the kids themselves. I think that was a really, really important point. And a lot of other things, but I suspect that's probably enough or maybe too much to give you a flavor for what we talked about.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing, Tim. And if we have more time, we can circle
There's another
on that.
5 pages there now.
I know, I'm just like scrolling through my Google Doc of everything I wrote down. Lots of good content. Adriana, you want to jump in and share some of what y'all chatted about?
Can you guys hear me? Did I unmute? Yeah, okay. So we chatted about so many things, and my group was lovely. So thank you all. My 2 groups were lovely. So thank you all. We chatted about the question around who are the cross-sector allies in your community who could be working together to connect kids with the mental health benefits of time outside, and whether or not they're collaborating. And if they're not, what could we do to change that? So in my first group, we talked, I had Louise, Lenny, and Melanie in my group. And we talked about, Louise brought up that they have Growing Up Boulder where she is, and it's a program kind of framed in a kid-friendly way with adult partners that know the research. So we have to have a deliberate way of sharing the research with all of the partners across these programs. So if we're partnering with the city departments, school districts, universities, and community organizations, there has to be a way to share the research that we're doing across all of these groups. And she shared the Children in Nature Network Research Library that has a mental health outcomes search term with all of the infographics as a way for groups to monitor research and get it out as easily as possible. Lenny shared with us about, she's with the Oregon Health and Outdoors Initiative, working to increase access to outdoor preschools. And she said she's having some policy and licensing challenges So she said that some alleys that she'd love to work with is bringing together a summit and bringing the health department, the education department, and parks and rec departments to the table, just because right now each is working in their area of expertise. But right now we can see that outdoor spaces are a huge tool, but there's legal challenges with having littles in outdoor spaces all the time, primarily safety concerns. So if we could get the health department to the table, they could address these concerns on the spot. And to which Luis brought up ECHO, so the early childhood health outdoors, which is pushing for access to greening preschools and childcare centers. So that's a great resource to help Lenny in that work. We also talked about Melanie's work in Oklahoma City, and she mentioned that Oklahoma City is a Thrive Outside city, and they have great partners as a whole city. Holistically, they have partnered with the Indian Health Clinic, which is not somebody that I would personally think of, but she mentioned that 10% of Oklahomans are registered with a tribe, so that's a great partner for them. But somebody that they need to work with is more the government, because they need policy, they need dollars for the fact of sustainability. In our second roundup here, we moved on, and Dana brought up that she works in Denver, and she brought up Yoli Casas and Vive Wellness, where there's female leaders and mothers and family-based parks and rec program or recreation programs, and they have swim lessons, and there's park activators that promote these safe outdoor spaces. Dan brought up a really interesting point with Arc'teryx, that they of a partner that I personally would not have thought of bringing in car sharing groups to collectively solve issues of transportation to outdoor spaces. And just with the question of bringing together community and solving problems together instead of separately. And so that's just a great resource and somebody to bring to the table. And Danielle in Maryland has a great coalition funded by her Maryland State Department of Education that brings together families, mental health providers, and school and staff personnel, that has also worked with different foundations for funding, and Shore River's Nurture by Nature program to bring in youth that has been diagnosed with mental health issues to have access to these programs in the outdoors. So just so many different things, and I loved hearing all of them. And a little bit about where I was coming from is the partnerships that I experience is I work really closely with, as a Parks and Rec professional, I work really closely with my school district. And I mentioned that in my previous position, we had a school garden in partnership with a local farm to fork nonprofit and UC Davis that's really close to me. They sent us an intern, and the farm to fork organization provided educational materials, curriculum, and professional development tools for us as educators to teach our students. And us with Luis, we had a great conversation of this possibility of Parks and Rec departments having these agreements with the school district of greening schools and leaving the schools open as public spaces and parks after school hours, or using parks as learning spaces in this weird COVID time where we want these kids to be learning outdoors. But just so many things, and I hope that I summarized it well enough. There was just so much great information, but yeah, that was the gist of it all.
That was great. Thanks so much. Also, I think you said there's someone from Denver in your program or in your group, maybe it was Dana, just reminded me of the amazing adventure forest at, okay, cool, thumbs up, it was Dana. The adventure forest at the Denver Children's Museum. I got to visit it last summer when I was at the City Parks Alliance Greater Greener Conference. And if you haven't checked it out, it's amazing. They have created this whole secret language for kids there, and it's all based, the designer who did it camped out on site for a number of weeks to learn about the wildlife in the area. And there are these beautiful themes that go throughout, and you feel like you're sitting in a giant bird's nest. I could obviously go on about that project. I will stop myself, but definitely look it up. It's super cool. Let's see, Zuza, do you want to share a little bit about your group?
Of course, sure. So I my breakout group was very small, and it was all around the question of how are you and your organization staying resilient in the light of obstacles such as COVID-19, funding shortages, and limited outreach. And we had a very small breakout group at first. It was just Jillian from Minnesota and me, and then Tanya from Ottawa, from the Royal Institute of Mental Health joined. And mainly our sharing centered around the change in practices with the pandemic at first. And we didn't get too much into funding and collaboration, simply because it mostly there was a big shift in how everything was operated because of the changing health regulations in different states, as well as in Canada. Moving a lot of the programming out online, but also trying to maintain still personal contacts via small in-person events. The online programming is very challenging for not only the participants, but also for the organizers, because especially when you're dealing with mental health issues and issues of perhaps access to internet and access to privacy, it becomes very complicated. Jillian shared that she is working with 3 environmental centers in her city, and that they had quite a bit of success of supporting the families throughout the summer with programming online and in small in-person events. And Tanya shared that for her, even though it didn't affect her personal work, because she's mostly working with youth programs, prevention and promotion on a more administrative level, she definitely knows that the mental health services or the need for mental health services increased, yet the actually servicing the community mostly affected, like homeless or at-risk youth or families, were not able to be served and are still in limbo. So with all the city planning that we talked then in the second panel with Tim's group, integrating those marginalized and fragile and vulnerable groups into all the planning and having them be a participatory element is really important.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Suza. Janie, can we pop over to you and hear a bit from your group?
Sure, yeah. So we had a great conversation. We were a little intimate group too, but we got a lot of conversation covered. So, and again, the question that we were asking, since they seem to be a little bit different, was that what did the panel miss? And what examples do you have of ways to connect kids with nature, particularly during COVID, that would benefit the conversation? And so we initially started out chatting about the virtual mediums that were now being popularized and used for meetings and how that might be continued and scaled. It's been essential for getting over the stress and pain of social isolation and not being able to connect with the outdoors and connect with your fellow people in the field, but also the people that you're trying to connect to the outdoors in the same way. So thinking about how to scale that and continue that, and also exploring how that might help to continue to connect people who just aren't normally able to be engaged in the field, including, perhaps people who are disabled, or, you know, or people who are just not normally engaged in the same way or equitably in being engaged in these virtual mediums. Working to cultivate those action-oriented partnerships at the local level, and making sure that we're supporting those partnership and relationship-specific actions. And I think we got a little bit beyond just the conversation of COVID and talking about how to support, following up on today's keynote, which I let my group know, but unfortunately I was unable to attend because I'm adhering to some campaign finance laws and can't participate in anything but this exact panel, which I got special exception to do. So I missed the panel this morning, unfortunately, but it sounded amazing. And talking about how to cultivate those amazing people at those hyper-local levels, and how do you create spaces and bring in the voices in these areas that are going to be as impactful as you know, our keynote this morning, and talking about how to create space for people to step up in those leadership roles. And that kind of got us into the talking about the resources that go into it, and in creating those spaces, and how there's some issues with the funding community in particular when it comes to this, including, you know, there's if you're going to have leadership in park agencies and park adjacent nonprofits that are going to be reflective of the communities they serve, then you're going to need some funding sources that help to support that. And that includes the issues in the funding community with not necessarily being more interested in funding the programming as opposed to the structure of the organizations that implement that programming. For example, you know, you have I used Sierra Club as an example because that's where my position is housed, and it's a long established organization, it's a unionized organization, it's big, and so we have a lot of overhead. So when I get grants from different organizations, it's tricky because we're trying to do some great work in increasing equitable access to the outdoors, but organizations, funders are a little turned off by the overhead, which is actually getting this work done and being able to implement this programming. And for me, I have the privilege of being able to have access to Sierra Club resources, whereas you have these BIPOC-led organizations who are serving BIPOC populations who don't necessarily have access to the business structure resources as someone like me might have, and also not have necessarily the funding to get paid for their work to be implementing this programming and to be leaders that are able to represent communities, you know, that were talked about today. So I think that was really important, especially noting that we're in COVID right now, and we are we're in a little bit of a financial crisis with this, where most of our park agencies and park adjacent nonprofits are facing funding crises, and there's not being much done there's not much being done to address that truly. And I know a study earlier this year showed that environmental education organizations, 75% were saying that if they didn't get some sort of emergency financial assistance, it's very likely that they would have to close operations by the end of the year or early in 2021. And there's not really been an update on that. And I can't imagine that their condition is improved because Congress really hasn't taken action. Donations are on the, you know, they're not as strong as they've been. And it's just a very precarious situation. So I think that that's part of how that continued issue in the park agency and park adjacent nonprofit world and the funding world, and elevating those leaders in those community spaces and actually getting kids connected to nature is being exacerbated during COVID. And so, you know, I tried to capture a very broad conversation in these brief notes, but I would love to invite Dan or Dana, if you have additional, because I don't believe Kristen's on the call here, if you have additional takeaways that I didn't capture, I would love to hear them now. I just want to make sure that I got everything and captured, because you guys were amazing and we had great conversation.
I just hope we all stay connected,
yeah.
Really, because these conversations were so rich.
Yeah, it's hard to capture them in just a few short takeaways. It was more dynamic than that, but yeah. Dan, anything you wanted to add?
That was great. That was, yeah, spot on. Again, it was a great conversation, and I think that yeah, like Dana said, just keeping that conversation going of how do we move it forward. So no, it's great.
Yeah, looking forward with continuing the conversation with all of you. So thanks so much, Caroline. I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, and I think we will have some time after I report back that if you guys want to, if people in the group want to jump in with things that they talked about on their panel or their breakout room, we can definitely do that. I don't know about y'all, but I have like a million tabs open on my computer right now from things that people have shared that I'm so excited to dig into. So I also wanted to remind you that we are saving the chats, and I think we'll be sharing that. So if you didn't catch all the links, or you have about 100 tabs open and you're overwhelmed, don't worry, we will be sharing that. So let's see, from my group, so my first group, it was actually just Danielle and me having great conversations. So really cool to get to have a lot of one-on-one time to chat. And she told me a lot about some work that has been going on in the schools in her area in Maryland that she's been involved in. I thought it was really interesting to hear how they have been working with some students who suffer from severe anxiety and have been able to connect them to the outdoors and bringing them out to the outdoors for some of those benefits. We also talked about the kind of need to be able to quantify some of the benefits from that. So maybe she can, when we break it open, can speak to that a little bit more. But we also talked about this Nurture by Nature group that is working to build resilience and self-esteem and leadership to give confidence to go out into the outdoors. So I thought that was really great. It reminded me a little bit of the keynote of talking about building that independence and kind of confidence within nature. And we also talked about building the families into the programming, because she was talking about a kayaking trip that people did. And one of the children said, man, I wish my mom could see me do this. And so they amended the program a little bit to bring the families in so that the families could see kind of at the end of the program what their kids had been involved in. Thought that also kind of looped back to what Zuzo was talking about with the importance of integrating families in so that we get kind of that root system. And then let's see, we also did touch a little bit on post-traumatic growth, especially following COVID. I might drop a link to yet another great source where Dr. Gotti has talked a little bit about potential for that, because we all know that this has been a rather traumatic time with COVID and many compounding factors, one of which Danielle and I talked about with the presence of the wildfires in California and throughout the West Coast being on a new level, which has been interesting for me having just moved out here. But we were talking about some of the positive things that can come out of this. And then my other group, there's this great thing that Tammy shared where she was talking about working with kids, working in programming with kids, and saying how important it is to ask kids what they want to do in the programming. And one of the girls said, I desperately need to climb a tree. I love that quote. I have felt that before. And I think that's something I never would have thought in setting up programming for kids, like, okay, go climb a tree time. But you know, that's all of the more reason that's important to ask about that. And really to involve children, not only in the planning process for public space, but in the planning for the programming as well. We also had Tammy talk to us a little bit about this program where they had a wild box where they would bring different things, elements from nature into the program. So it might be pelts, animal pelts, and really give kids access to learning more about the environment. But programs like that have been on the decline. So she was talking about the importance of sort of bringing those back. Let's see. And she said that they were planning to work with a local school to design a park, but that was put on the back burner with COVID. So hopefully things like that can really come back into play. And we chatted some about the benefit of when you observe nature, there's this slowing down to observe nature. I know that's something that's come up in some of the other conference panels that I've been a part of. I think it was the All Trails panel where people were saying it's actually been a beautiful thing about COVID is that it's really been a forced slowdown for a lot of folks that has encouraged a lot of observation. Let's see. And then one of the conversations I really loved is we were talking about the importance of this reciprocity. Especially when it comes to community engagement. So we were reflecting a little bit on the keynote and saying, going to meet communities and ask them for opinions on things is of course very important, but sometimes we don't see things come to fruition for a long time. I know in my experience, the park I worked on is not set to be done for 50 years. And so saying we promise we'll integrate your ideas, but they won't be done for decades really is delayed gratification. And so the importance of really giving back to people so it doesn't feel like this kind of checking a box to engage with folks, but actually building this relationship and sense of trust within the community is really important. And then we also heard from Sue, some of that was from Sue, and then also she talked a little bit about being a forest therapy guide. And I loved this. She said she gives kids the invitation to explore and interact with the environment with it, where they are in their own way. And it becomes a lot, a much more rich experience because of that. Instead of telling them what to see, she kind of asks them what stood out to them and then challenges them to dig into why that stood out to them. And chatted a little bit about going down to the creek, seeing the different types of rocks, the smooth and bumpy rocks, and how much kids really love having that kind of unprescribed time, which I think is especially important with how programmed so many days are, especially pre-COVID, you know, school to sports to homework to whatever, but really creating those times when people can just enjoy passive recreation and have that opportunity to be curious is very key. So that's kind of the recap I have from my panel. I hope I covered everything. Feel free to jump in, folks who were with me if I missed anything. And if you don't have anything to say, I also want to open it up to panelists. If you kind of realize there were some notes you didn't get to, feel free to jump in with those.
Have we heard from everybody? I feel like we're missing someone.
Tim just has his camera off right now, but I think we heard 1, 2, 3, hold on, 4. I think that was everyone.
Luis, did you share or did I just like zone out for a second?
Oh, Luis isn't on the panel, but she was on the earlier panel, so that's why
why.
That I know I had that moment
man.
too. Yeah.
Luis was in my group. Why am I sorry guys, I'm brain farting. California, these time zones has me waking up real early for these panels. Like we started at 7 a.m. California time. That's a really early day for me. So excuse my brain fart.
Tim, did you want to jump in? I know you had a lot of notes and you had more that you didn't get to. Is there any more you want to share?
No, I think that I covered probably a lot of it. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Yeah, I mean, we talked about, there's some good discussion about some of the obstacles to connecting to nature in a city, and the weather was one of them that Tanya from Ottawa started us talking about, and but just a kind of general, how do you overcome some of the, you know, it's cold outside, and how do I get outside why do I, you know, want to be walking around looking at nature in the middle of winter? And then there was some good discussion, and we have some wonderful stories of cities like Edmonton that have developed winter strategies, by the way, to sort of explicitly get over those obstacles, get people outside and creating interesting things, an ice castle that they build every winter, and getting them on ice skates, and urban design standards that, you know, incorporate windbreaks and warming stations and so on. Let's see, Melanie got us talking about water, which I thought it's something I didn't get to mention. Blue nature, which I don't know has come up at all yet, and a really important aspect of nature in cities, right? Many cities are on a river or on some kind of water body, or and so that was really important to think about. And so, and with the water comes lots of other critters and creatures and animals that you might not see otherwise. And I was telling about, we have a film about Gotham Whale, this New York City nonprofit that's helping to connect folks to the humpback whales that are returning to the waters of New York, which is, so the idea of having awe and wonder all around us, you know, and water helps to really make that possible. Let's see, I think that's about it. Susa, you were telling us about sort of the importance of participatory planning and culturally significant input from different groups, and mentioning the organization 880 cities, which is really wonderful. The idea of, you know, we've got to think about a city. This circles back to Louise's comment about her experience consulting kids. But we need multi-generational, intergenerational cities where all age groups come together to enjoy and connect with that natural world. So
yeah, we're currently working with El Laboratorio in training youth on the basics of urban forestry in green infrastructure, to create a basis for participatory and planning work for the future, with a greater vision of creating culturally significant kind of like a pearl necklace along the river lines of little parks and greenways that can be activated. We're working in particular with the African American, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. And so for all of these communities, it's essential that the youth also connects back to their elders, or to the community base of the OGs, to really have a greater understanding of their personal and community history, and then gain with that like an empowerment and agency to envision and create something that maybe is blocked from, you know, the elders to see, because they're the ones that, you know, our young generations are the ones that have to think ahead of what they want to see and how they would like to develop their own spaces for the future. So we're working on that currently in Denver.
I was going to ask what cities. So that's Denver you're talking about.
Yeah, this is in Denver. Yeah. Yes.
Right.
I shared a link to River Sisters for you, Zuza. I like that you brought up that work, and that it's so powerful locally, and then the connection between there's actually a formal agreement between the mayor of Denver and the mayor of San Luis Rio Colorado in the state of Sonora, Mexico, that's supporting kind of very similar investments and continuing conversations across those two cities. So it's a very, you know, culturally informed international kind of project, which is really cool.
And the idea is really to expand that concept of sister cities to actually a Pleiades, like communities along the river, and that whose resources we all share. And we need to become not only aware, but conscious about stewarding that, and about our own consumption. Energy-wise, and keeping the waters clean. And so on many different levels, we engage the community, not only to learn, but also to steward the waters and the land.
It looks like we lost Caroline, but I think this, yeah, I don't know what happened. But if anyone has any questions, this is a great time to bring them up. I know that we're a small, intimate group right now. So like we said, turn on your video, turn on your sound. We're welcome to chat. But yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys.
So Adriana, I'd like to bring back the question that came up in your group, which is, do people have ideas for how to get all the physical and mental health benefits of connecting with nature out to all these groups that are involved in, you know, city greening and community greening? Because I think part of what Shift is based on is that this research provides a really strong tool for, you know, getting funding, for getting commitment and buy-in to greening the places where we live. So just maybe we could we spend a few minutes brainstorming that?
Absolutely. I mean, I asked the question and I brought it up in my breakout rooms because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. And I think that I personally would love to see more connections just in the work I do and in my community. And I'm sure that everyone has such great networks in what they're doing. And I would love to pull from those examples. And just, how did you guys get there? And Louise, I think you're bringing up such great points, and it's, the research backs all of these things. So yeah, if anyone has things that they'd love to share, please feel free.
I wanted to kind of bring up what has come up in other panels about the danger of, again, green gentrification that happens with parks and greenways, because that has been historically what has happened. My son-in-law, Alessandro Regolon, who is an urban planner and has been very active in working with communities in LA and many other places in the United States to combat that affliction of urban gentrification in neighborhoods. So this is even like a family issue for us to make sure that really equity is at the forefront, equity and inclusion. Promotores Verdes works actually with some community organizations that are Spanish-speaking parents with children of disabilities. So we have, many of our families have children with Down syndrome or children that cannot even move, that have to be carried around on their backs, or to have these nature experiences. And usually they don't get any services, whether it's for mental health or even physical movements. And that sort of isolation is real. And it's actually, there are large numbers of families and people that are affected. We just don't see them, just like the families that are affected with homelessness. That is a problem that is exacerbated now with COVID.
I just want to, I'm just going to second that. I am just, it's so funny to have you on the call, especially just because, and for him to be your family, because I'm constantly touting that study, the Just Green Enough report. I'm just bringing it up constantly. I think that I work in a world where we're talking big level policy and we're talking big level funding, and we have these big, and my member organizations have these big research projects where they talk about how to develop, how to place make, how to develop communities, and how to do it equitably. And I think that there's just this, I'm going to be doing more research on this just to educate myself a little bit more, but I've been seeing this trend of how important it is to inject funding into communities to reduce blight and to assist low-income BIPOC communities, and how that's a really important concept, but how the Just Green Enough concept comes into that and combines with that is really a difficult thing to navigate, because that concept says you need to have really you need to have an effective community engagement process to do that effectively. And so, you know, there's this this conversation that I've seen in a couple of reports that's like, I think that injection of the money is more important than the community engagement process. And I think that this year, more than ever, I've kind of leaned to the fact that community engagement is just as important as the injection of funding in building community trust and having racial equity and justice, and that the injection of money is one component, but it can certainly not be enough to surmount the socioeconomic issues that we have in communities in building long-term trust with communities that have been neglected and not included in the process and pushed out of their communities. And so I think it's a difficult thread to, you know, it's a difficult needle to thread, but one that is really interesting to explore. And if anybody has more insight on that than I do, it's something that I've just started to really dive into the research on the in reconciling the gap between those two trains of thought and how to actually implement that policy-wise, and I've been thinking about how to work that into some proposed legislation that Oak will be working on in the next few months and years. And it's an interesting thing to navigate that I'm trying to dive into more. So bringing that up, and if anybody has additional insight or things to add on that, I would love to hear it.
I would say that private and public partnerships are key. I come from the United Nations background, work with the Sustainable Development Goals, and grew up with a global perspective. And I notice here that in the United States in particular, oftentimes the social and environmental injustice issues are left to be solved for nonprofits and community organizations who really usually don't end up with the funding. The funding goes to the public agencies and institutions, the places that actually have more ability for fundraising and grant writing, rather than really the organizations on the ground that are doing the work. And that is something that needs to shift, I think, because it is, again, a form of using slave labor or free labor rather than validating the importance of participatory process.
I'm not involved in too much work in participatory processes with policy, but I do a fair amount of participatory research that involves youth. And I think from there, if policy is based on research that uses participatory principles and engages the voice of the beneficiaries, I think that's an important place to focus. I've also seen a lot of research on how do you develop like advisory councils that can then inform policy directly, certainly targeting those individuals who represent the key populations of need. And I think a big piece in that is sort of, I think sometimes your hard to reach populations are also hard to engage in sort of the more complex, certainly with children and youth. The younger you go, or the more disadvantaged, like not connected to school, you know, maybe developmental disabilities, the harder it is to sit at a high level table and have a conversation with them. So then you need to have intermediary individuals who can bring them in and speak for them. And so those kinds of processes need to be put in place as well.
Yeah. Katia, the Placemaking with Children and Youth book that I've dropped in the chat, in our own work, we have a commitment that at least half of our projects will involve youth from disadvantaged communities or children with disabilities. And we find there are a number of methods in the book for using kids as a way to get to their communities, to their parents, their families, their larger communities. They can often be the voice to make that link. And you can then have methods that bring the other people, adults in their communities, into the process.
That's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Certainly if there's, I think, cultural and language barriers. I think because I do a lot of evaluation work, I think especially younger children, they can always speak to their experiences, you know, what they feel is harmful, what's positive, but they may not be able to speak to what systems are influencing that, those experiences. And so often we have sort of older youth who have gone through, who do have, conflict resolution skills and do understand budgets and do have skill sets that they can, sit and have those higher level conversations to then also represent those individuals who can speak to, on a day-to-day basis, this is what I'm living, and their families as well.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Sorry that I cut out for a minute. I had a Wi-Fi problem. I knew that was bound to happen at some point this week. I did want to say, maybe you guys touched on this, but with the conversation, somebody mentioned 880 cities, and I dropped it in the chat. And I've had the privilege of getting to hear Gil Penalosa, who runs that organization, speak a number of times. He's incredibly passionate, great to listen to. But the whole notion of that organization, 880, comes from the idea of if we design cities, instead of designing them for as if everybody in the city is 30 and incredibly fit, design them for 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds, use them as your indicator species. And if you design for those two people groups, then it will serve everyone in between. So I encourage you to look up 880 cities. They do really incredible work. Let's see, we have about 5 more minutes if anyone wants to jump in with some final thoughts in here.
This has been great. I was going to say too, like, one thing that's coming up for me is around the importance of the supporter relationship. So like being from a for-profit organization and funder, as we look to the nonprofits, because they realize that mission that we value and realize that expertise that they have. And that's where our support comes. I think, we intentionally don't put restrictions on our grants, so they should be used as the recipient wants them to be used. But I think there's an interesting question coming up in my head around, we never get to speak to the other funders and the other partners. And I wonder what that conversation looks like, because the reality is, if we're truly committed to the work of that nonprofit, we're aligned on that mission. So as funders, we are all aligned around that mission. And what does that look like if as a group of funders, you come together and talk around how does that nonprofit realize the resources that all the funding community has? It's not a question that I ever see. I know from talking to our nonprofit partners, there are more restrictions placed by other funders and I think different intentions, but I don't get to see what they are. And how, if we do ultimately believe in the mission, that's what we should be trying to support. So how as a funding community do you do that in a better way? No answers, but I think it's an interesting question that's come up in my head.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love how at Shift it's bringing together so many different perspectives too, and bringing together funders and these people that have both the quantitative and qualitative backgrounds as well. I've seen a lot of really cool synergy in the different breakout rooms with that. Any other points, especially from non-panelists, that wanted to jump in these final minutes? Thanks for sharing that, Dan.
I'll respond to Dan's comment. Hi, Dan. I think it's just so refreshing to hear a funder say that. I had an experience earlier this summer with a donor who was really inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, which is wonderful. And he is not Black, but he had a specific program, like he wants it a certain way. And it's just really, like, it's just so hard to explain or educate him that it's not for him or I really to decide. It's how do we engage the community we want to help and align that with the mission of what we do. So Dan, thank you for that comment.
Well, Melanie, sometimes in a case like that, can you take this potential donor into the field where maybe he's in the middle of a meeting that involves the community, and then he can experience for himself what the value of that is?
Yeah, I think that's a great, I think that's a great suggestion. I wish his mind was as open as his wallet. I don't know, you know, so, but I agree, kind of almost starting at a really almost informal level to help open his eyes and his awareness to what's going on.
I really like that phrase. I wish his mind was as open as his wallet. I wrote that one down. Yeah, thank you guys for sharing that. We actually have just like 2 more minutes and then we're wrapping up, and we'll have a little bit of a break before the closing talks at 12:30, I believe. So time to get lunch and time to take a little bit of a space to decompress and let some of this marinate, because this has been a lot of good info. I was just messaging with Alyssa, who will be talking with me at the close, and we were saying, how are we going to capture all this brilliance from this week? We're just going to try to like echo what we heard back, because there's so much incredible content here.